Green Foster in the American Journal of Public Health. They got a ton of press about this last week, and I think it's really important, if you haven't seen it, to see it. I do think that Sarah's work also has, it intersects around evaluating state-level abortion restrictions and state-level policies targeting alcohol and drug use during pregnancy. She's developed an evidence base to really inform what genuine public health approaches should be to abortion and abortion facility standards. She's published her amazing research in Social Science and Medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, Maternal Child Health Journal, and Alcohol and Alcoholism. Dr. Roberts received her undergraduate degree in history from Columbia University, her master's in public health, and a graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Michigan, and her doctorate in public health from the University of California at Berkeley. She's currently the primary investigator of an R01 from the National Institutes of Health and a Preterm Birth Initiative RAP grant to study the impact of state-level policies targeting alcohol and drug use during pregnancy. After Sarah provides us an overview of her amazing work and of the work of the field, we'll hear from my good friend, collaborator, and just mentor, Lynn Roberts. Lynn Roberts is a lawyer, and she has a Juris Doctorate. She's the founder of and executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization that works to ensure the dignity, rights, and health of all pregnant people, whether they seek to go to term, to have an abortion, or to experience those who experience pregnancy loss. Ms. Paltrow is a graduate of Cornell University, New York University School of Law, and she has worked on numerous cases challenging restrictions on the right to choose abortion, as well as cases opposing the prosecution and punishment of pregnant women seeking to continue their pregnancies to term. She has worked as a senior staff attorney at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, as director of the specialty at the Center for Reproductive Law, Health, and Policy, and as the vice president for public affairs for Planned Parenthood of New York City. She's a frequent guest lecturer and writer for the Popular Press, for law reviews, and for peer-reviewed journals. She also is a Gemini and mother of 25-year-old twins, and I finally got to meet her wife last night, which was really, really great. So I'm going to ask Sarah to come up first, and please provide us an overview and the slides that you prepared, and then we'll go right into Lynn's presentation, and then I'll invite you to join me in a conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. How do I pull up my slides? Go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm going to start at the end and give you the messages that I hope that you'll take from what I'm going to talk about over the next 20 minutes. I think the first message to start with is you should not assume that existing policies targeting alcohol and drug use during pregnancy have any of the intended effects, including effects on reducing use during pregnancy, reducing adverse birth outcomes, or reducing racial disparities in child protective services reporting. And based on what I'm going to share with you, I would also like to argue that rather than continue on with the types of policies that are currently in place in relation to alcohol and drug use during pregnancy, we really need to step back and start again to envision policies, a healthcare system, and a public health system that genuinely support pregnant women who use alcohol and drugs. So I started this work more than a decade ago at the suggestion of one of my fabulous mentors who is in this room right now, Dr. Sherry Pies, years ago in a neighboring county as part of a coalition called the Perinatal Substance Abuse Partnership. And one of the aspects of work that the partnership wanted to focus on was barriers to prenatal care for pregnant women who use drugs. And so what we did was we conducted a number of interviews and focus groups with pregnant women who use drugs or women who had used alcohol and drugs while they were pregnant, to ask them about barriers to prenatal care, as well as what they would recommend that we do as part of a community awareness campaign around prenatal care for pregnant women who use drugs. In terms of some of the barriers that we identified in our conversation, we identified that they face bureaucratic and logistical barriers. So things like difficulty getting Medicaid, Medi-Cal to cover prenatal care, difficulties in terms of transportation, in terms of child care. They also reported a desire to have a healthy baby. For some of them, that was the reason they went to prenatal care. Some of them described it as a way to compensate for the other bad things that they were doing. For others of them, that desire to have a healthy baby actually led them to avoid prenatal care. And one of the explanations for that was that they were worried that if they went, they would find out that they had already irreversibly damaged their baby. They reported believing that it was necessary to stop using drugs before going to the doctor, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then they were absolutely terrified that they would be reported to Child Protective Services, lose children, and go to jail. So this is an image that one of the women who participated drew. What you can see is a woman, a pregnant woman smoking something. And there's a baby speaking, saying, "Mommy, don't lose, get help not to use." And if you use, you both lose. Now the message here, to remind you, we had asked them to give us input on what a community awareness campaign about prenatal care should look like for pregnant women who use drugs. And the message here is not about prenatal care. The message here is about stopping drug use. And so this was not the first time this came up. And so I started asking women, we asked you to draw us a picture about what we should say about prenatal care, and you're coming back to us. It's a message about drug use, stopping drug use. And one of the women said, you know what, a lot of women that are going through that don't go to the doctor because they're using. And that is the first step. You have to get some help. There's nothing else I can say. They're not going to go to the doctor if they're using because they don't want them to know that they're pregnant and using. Another said I had to leave, actually physically leave to go get clean because I couldn't have stayed here and gotten clean. It was not an option. I didn't consider prenatal care until I was home. I probably should have. I felt really guilty, but it was like, as long as I was getting clean in my head, that was like step one, stop there, stop using, stop doing bad. Then once you started getting clean, it was like guilt. That's what's really funny. I mean, as soon as I felt I was ready for prenatal care, I got it. So certainly things that we might expect in terms of fear of judgment, fear, feelings of guilt, feelings of embarrassment were a component of feeling as if they had to stop using before they went to care. But the biggest reason that women reported was that they were absolutely terrified of being reported to Child Protective Services. We didn't ask this question directly. It came up in almost every single one of the one-on-one interviews, as well as in both focus groups. Because of this fear, some women avoid prenatal care, others get prenatal care in spite of the fear, and then others reported going to prenatal care to build a track record to keep their baby or reunify with other children. As one said, if I don't go, it counts as abuse or neglect. So I think what's really important to remember as we're talking about that fear is that fear is warranted. We looked at data in the county where we collected the data from women about reports to Child Protective Services related to maternal drug use during the time period. And overall, 1% of all newborns were reported to Child Protective Services related to maternal drug use during that time period. There's also a dramatic racial disparity in the reports, about a 4-to-1 ratio. That means about 3.5% of all Black newborns were reported to Child Protective Services related to maternal drug use in that county. So one of the ideas that was discussed a lot around that time was, how do we resolve the racial disparity in reporting to Child Protective Services related to maternal drug use? And so one of the ideas that was discussed was, if we can standardize or universalize our procedures for urine testing and for reporting, maybe that'll reduce the disparities. So I've published about how some of the logic in between that doesn't quite make sense. But we also did a study where we looked at a hospital that had adopted a standardized protocol at the time of delivery to identify and respond to prenatal substance use. And what we found when we looked at that, to see whether or not it had impacted racial disparities in Child Protective Services reporting, is that it did not. Standardizing the protocols did not reduce racial disparities in Child Protective Services reporting related to maternal alcohol and drug use. And what we argue in the paper is that, in fact, these standardized protocols may actually just institutionalize existing racism. So these protocols often use factors to identify who to screen and who to report that are more common among Black women than white women. So factors such as having a previous preterm birth or limited prenatal care. So since then, I've taken the work that I've done on a very local level and really started looking at state policies across the US and across time. So I've been working on 2 studies that we combine now we're combining looking at drugs as well, looking at policies targeting both alcohol and now drug use during pregnancy. So this is a graph of all the different policies in the US targeting alcohol use during pregnancy and the trends in those policies over time. What you can see is that they are increasing dramatically over time. There's a bunch of different ones, not just Child Protective Services reporting. Those in yellow are those that are clearly punitive, and those that are in blue are what we call supportive, or at least at best, or at least not punitive. So they include things like the punitive ones defining alcohol use during pregnancy as child abuse or neglect, allowing civil commitment for use during pregnancy, requiring reporting to Child Protective Services. On the more supportive side, we have limits on criminal prosecution, reporting requirements for data collection or treatment purposes, mandatory warning signs, and giving pregnant women or pregnant women with children priority in terms of entering substance abuse treatment. So in addition to looking at these trends in the individual policies, we also looked at policy environments. So saying, does a state have only punitive policies, only supportive policies, or a mix of the 2? The yellow here are punitive, the blue are supportive, and the green are mixed. So there's a few things that I want you to take away from this graph. The first is that the first policy that went into effect was in 1974. So remember that date will become important as I move into the second half of the talk. But early on, they were punitive. Then soon in the 1980s, they started to be either supportive or punitive. And then beginning in the 90s, they started to become mixed. And the way that they became mixed was by adding punitive to supportive policies. What we see here is an overall trend towards an increase in punitive policies. So what I'm presenting to you now is the data related to alcohol and pregnancy policies. Just finished coding data related to drug use and pregnancy policies. And other than related to mandatory warning signs, they almost completely overlap. So policies that target alcohol use tend to also target drug use and vice versa. So here's outcomes. This is one of the first times we're presenting these publicly at all. The paper is under review and the next paper is under review as well. But what we did was we looked to see whether these policies that we have over 40 years that target alcohol use during pregnancy are related to alcohol use during pregnancy. We have the different policies down the left that we looked at and a variety of different drinking outcomes. The green arrows the green arrows that point up show where more drinking occurred, so the policy had an adverse effect. And the orange are where the policy had some sort of beneficial effect, so there was decreased drinking. So the overall take home from this is that most of the policies don't seem to relate to drinking during pregnancy at all. The only one that does and is consistent is policies that label alcohol use during pregnancy as child abuse and neglect. When we start looking at birth outcomes, so low birth weight, preterm birth, and then we also start looking at prenatal care utilization, we see a very different pattern. We see that almost all of the policies are actually associated with adverse birth. So across the board, mandatory warning signs and child abuse and neglect, as well as some of the more supportive policies, are also associated with increases in adverse birth outcomes. So I don't want to say that focusing at all on substance use in pregnancy, although from the previous slide, what I would say is if you want to reduce preterm birth, any of these policies targeting alcohol or drug use during pregnancy is not the way to go. We did have two variables, state-level policy variable, or some state-level policy variables that we controlled for in our models that we thought were notable that I wanted to share with you here. So we looked at one policy related to where wine can be sold and found that states that had that restricted where wine could be sold had lower preterm births. And then as a way to say, to look at all policies that might affect alcohol use at a population level, we looked at population level alcohol consumption and found that states where people drink more, there's also higher rates of preterm birth and low birth weight. There's a variety of different explanations for it. That does not mean that that is due to a reduction among pregnant women. It could be among partners. It could be a marker for something else, but I do think that that's worth noting as well. So for what I told you so far, it seems like what is going on isn't effective. And so there's a question of how did we get here and how do we get out of where we are? So one of the things that we did with the policy data was we said, okay, there's two different places that some of this policy making could be coming from. One of them is related to reproductive rights, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, and I know Lynn will talk about that quite extensively. But they could also be related to population or policies that are effective related to alcohol use in the general population. So, for example, something like drunk driving policies or alcohol taxation. And what you can see here, we looked at overlaps in 2013, was that punitive policies related to alcohol use during pregnancy were not associated with generally effective alcohol policies, nor were supportive policies. And also supportive policies were not associated with reproductive rights policies. However, states that had more punitive policies targeting alcohol use during pregnancy were the same states that had a lot of restrictions on abortion rights. Okay. So earlier I told you to remember 1974. Now we're going to talk a little bit about 1975. So this is one of the first papers that was published about fetal alcohol syndrome in the most recent era of attention to fetal alcohol syndrome. There's been other eras that have gone back quite a bit of time where people have focused on it. But the most recent era starts in the 1970s. So this is the abstract for one of these papers, and I'm going to read it to you. The frequency of adverse outcome of pregnancy for chronic alcoholic women suggests that serious consideration be given to early termination of pregnancy in severely chronic alcoholic women. So the recommendation here was that the way to solve and prevent fetal alcohol syndrome was to recommend abortion. Historian Janet Golden argues that the reason that the medical diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome stuck during this era was because there was a medical solution to the problem, with the medical solution being abortion. So for those of you who haven't made the connection, Roe versus Wade was decided 1973. We see the first policies targeting alcohol use during pregnancy in 1974. And then now we're seeing abortion recommended as the solution for alcohol use during pregnancy. So that recommendation that abortion was a solution and should be recommended for women who, chronic alcoholic women and women who drank a lot while they were pregnant, continued on in the literature throughout the 1970s and then dropped off in the 80s. On the alcohol side, there was a shift from public health recommendations to say, don't drink more than 6 drinks at a time while you're pregnant, to recommendations for complete abstinence. And along with these shifts towards recommendations for complete abstinence from alcohol use during pregnancy, there started to be an argument that recommendations might lead women to have abortions. And this is something that I've started to term abortion anxiety, since I think that there's a lot of abortion anxiety in our conversations about substance use and pregnancy. And I think we need to think a lot about that before we can really engage in what we should be doing on this topic. So the argument that was presented in the literature and also in some policy making was that recommending complete abstinence from alcohol use during pregnancy would lead women using low levels of alcohol to terminate otherwise wanted pregnancies. And also there was a concern that punitive policies regarding drug use during pregnancy could also lead to abortion. So we looked into this and investigated it using data from a national sample of women seeking abortion, and found that about 5% reported alcohol or drug use as a reason for abortion. But the important thing to know, the main important thing to know, is that almost all of these pregnancies were unintended. These were not otherwise wanted pregnancies, and that women were drinking considerably more than a low level. So we published this, and along with our publication, there was a commentary on the same issue by a researcher from Australia who said, essentially, this is great research, it's really important, and now that we know that recommending abstinence from alcohol use during pregnancy doesn't lead women to have abortions, we can make whatever recommendations regarding alcohol use during pregnancy we want. And so one of my colleagues and I, we immediately wrote back and said, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. What we should be focusing on, if we're focusing on policies related to substance use in pregnancy, and what our public health messages should be, is what effect those messages actually have on use during pregnancy and birth outcomes. So what I hope we'll take here is that when we're thinking about substance use in pregnancy, let's focus on what we're actually trying to do and not let it be part of a conversation that's really about abortion politics. So alcohol, drug, and pregnancy policies have not been developed through methods used to develop effective public health policies, and there really is no way to disentangle the current alcohol, drug, and pregnancy policies from abortion politics. So what I want to leave you with is the thought, which is, what would a healthcare system, a public health system, and a set of policies that truly support pregnant women who use alcohol and drugs look like? I'd like to acknowledge our funders. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Monica. Thank you to my friends and mentors, many of you in this audience. You know, I want to start with something I've been thinking about. The title of this Collaboratory series is When Pregnant Women Use Alcohol and/or Drugs. And I guess I would argue that really the title should be When Pregnant Women Are Human. By which I mean that I am learning and coming to the belief that we really do think of pregnant women as some kind of separate category of human. That we have to think about differently, that we have to set up special policies for who we suddenly pay attention to. And, you know, I think that that's a terrible mistake, that we need to incorporate the fact that people get pregnant and the survival of the species depends on people getting pregnant, but that is just like a life course phenomenon, which means that everybody ought to have access to healthcare, that how we think of healthcare should include maternity and reproductive healthcare, and it shouldn't be singled out. I also think that as we think about pregnant women, and I think of an early case I worked on in which a critically ill woman was forced to have cesarean surgery, despite the fact the judge knew it might kill her and the baby. And in fact, the cesarean surgery did kill her and her baby. And I've been in law school classes where students defend that court-ordered surgery. And I say to them, look, you know, one person can't be ordered to do anything for another person, and their status, they're both people, they're both constitutional people, human beings, human rights. I can't get even your blood, even if we were twins, even if we were mother and daughter, no court could order that. So I said, why is it that pregnant women in relationship to fetuses about whose status we don't agree on yet have fewer rights than other persons? And the law student looked at me and said, that's just the burden women bear. And you say that, but I am convinced that that is where we are as a matter of culture, as a matter of approach, and I have seen it articulated recently in federal district court, in New York State court, that it is really hard for people to wrap their minds around the idea that pregnant people are human beings. So let me give you a little bit of background on, let's see, how does this work? We talk a lot about, there's a lot of focus on drug use and alcohol use, and I wonder about that as well, since when you look at risk factors associated with pregnancy, really the data, as when I last looked at it, consistently talks about 4 to 5% of pregnant women using any of the criminalized substances. That number may have gone up somewhat as we talk about the increased use in opioids. But compared to other risk factors, it's numerically and proportionately one of the smallest numbers in terms of pregnancy, yet there is so much attention to it. And I think that has as much to do with the drug war and the usefulness it plays in regulating people in this country as anything else. And we choose drug use, and by the way, the drug that's still most often used by pregnant women is marijuana. We do that and ignore many other things that create risks, including this. It turns out, here's a story about a family who used a drug, knowing that it could cause serious harm to the pregnancy and the children who were born from it. And the drug that this woman took was a fertility drug. And she gives birth, she becomes pregnant and is carrying 7 embryos. One of them does not survive, one is born with severe disabilities. All of the children need a certain amount of care. And in Good Housekeeping, she's described as heroic. Her babies aren't called FERT babies. They aren't called anything. They have no names. We are supposed to be sympathetic and appreciative of the fact that here's a woman who did the best she could, having taken a drug, knowing that could harm her babies. We don't apply the same standards depending on race and which drug it is. When women used cocaine while they were pregnant and nevertheless gave birth to healthy babies, we called them crack babies, we called them all sorts of things, and not little miracles. And we didn't talk about the women in terms of their whole lives. In this story, we're told that the mother is a Christian who opposes abortion, who would never have selectively terminated any of the embryos to make it a healthier pregnancy. Yet nobody talks about why women might use a criminalized drug and also be opposed to abortion for religious reasons. Some of the other risks of harm are things like lead in the water, but nobody is talking about holding those who make that possible accountable because of what it does and much more. If you have lead, actually have lead in your system, it is evidence of poisoning. Unlike when people say you have a positive drug test, that doesn't, it's not, you don't have the drug in your system, you have a metabolite of that drug in your system. It is not evidence of poisoning or harm. And then we know that cigarettes, the evidence of potential harm, and that's also important. Please remember this, I know you're in the health field. Risk of harm is not the same as harm. Doesn't mean you actually do it, but the evidence of risk of harm from cigarettes is much greater than evidence of harm from any of the criminalized drugs. And in case you're wondering, that's a picture of me and my mother. I'm the young one. And she smoked all through her pregnancy and after, and I always like to say maybe if she hadn't smoked cigarettes, I'd be a for-profit lawyer. I don't know. But it is to say that's what it means, that something's a risk of harm, it doesn't necessarily cause harm. So I want to do a little brief look back about how we got to where we are in terms of policy. As you may recall, in the 1980s, there was an outcry about pregnant women using particularly cocaine. And the narrative was quite destructive. This was, here, these are showing a series from Time magazine. It was just one of literally hundreds of stories like this. Their mothers used drugs, and now it's the children who suffer. You get to the inside page, and you see what is presumably a very premature infant. Can the innocent legacies of drug use be rescued? If you have somebody who's innocent, what else do you have to have? Somebody who's guilty. So you have the story right there. And then you have innocent victims. And if you'll notice, as the picture becomes more menacing, and the beginning of the actual story is about those children exposed prenatally to cocaine, it's not how they said it, are going to be in school with your middle-class white kids, and they're going to be disrupting those classrooms. And look what happens to the skin color. as you get to the story, you get to the menacing story of the child in the school with your kid, and now it's a very dark-skinned kid. So there's a racial narrative going on through this. You have the same thing in Rolling Stone magazine, where the baby portrayed is Black, and they say these babies born to crack-addicted mothers are like no others. They're brain damaged. They're oblivious to any affection. Who would do this to their baby? Why would anybody believe a group of people would be doing this to their babies? It can only be believed if you hold other underlying prejudice and assumptions about the population you're claiming care so little about their babies. And then you have this. Crack babies, the worst threat is mom herself. And this is a recurring narrative, particularly in the United States, which is, even now, in the middle of the opioid crisis, essentially what we're told is the greatest risk to children is not climate change, it's not the new tax law, it's not unfunding or threatening to unfund child health insurance. It is their own moms. And this first on the left is a story from 1989 about so-called crack babies. And let me bring you forward to 2011, an ad campaign by anti-abortion activists with giant posters saying the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. So again, who creates danger to our children? It's not systems, it's not our government, it's not collective responsibility, it's not fathers, it is mothers. And it's a very damaging and demeaning narrative, and particularly about Black motherhood, which is something that is a direct legacy from slavery, in which, in order to justify a system of slavery in which mothers were sold apart from their children, it's okay, these women don't really care about their babies. And that story is deeply embedded. And what that means is, if we're trying to come up with policies that are going to work, we're going to have to address the underlying racism, the underlying both racism and sexism that allows that story just to get retold in new ways. What policies and laws coincided with the media coverage of the so-called crack crisis or epidemic? And the primary policy responses were not supportive or compassionate. They were, as you heard, primarily punitive. We started to see prosecutions of pregnant women and new mothers. We did a study on the number of arrests and detentions of pregnant women between 1973 and 2005. And you'll notice that the largest number of arrests are occurring in 1989, 90, and 91, which is during that called crisis. But you'll also see that it doesn't go away once the information became clearly available that the science did not support the conclusion that use of cocaine, in fact, caused any set of predictable permanent harms. You also saw the expansion of state child welfare laws to reach pregnant women in relationship to the eggs, embryos, and fetuses they carry. You had expansion of state civil commitment laws, and a law in Wisconsin that uniquely combines the child welfare code to treat women carrying fertilized eggs as if they themselves are children, and allowing the state to lock them up if they admit to past any use of alcohol or drugs. There's an amendment in 2003 to the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that is often misread, but used to further involvement of child welfare in response to pregnant women and who use any amount of drugs and alcohol. There were some modest funding set-asides relating to pregnant women, but many of those no longer exist. And you also had such things as a privately funded crack children requiring a caring community, now called Project Prevention, and now offering $300 to pregnant women who use drugs to get sterilized or use long-acting birth control. So these are some of the images of the parents and families who were affected by policies of arrest. Many times we were able, National Advocates for Pregnant Women were able to get those charges dismissed, but the stories and the practices continue. And now we have several states which actually, as a result of judicial decision, allow and encourage arrests of women under these circumstances. But we found that the data that showed that the targets for arrest, detention, and forced interventions are overwhelmingly low-income women. 52% are African American. Oh, I should go back and just tell you, this is a mom in Virginia, one of the British Smith. She knew she had a problem with her cocaine use while she was pregnant. So she, while pregnant, went through the phone book and called every drug treatment program in Virginia, and everyone said either we don't take pregnant women or because you'd rely on Medicaid, we'll put you on a waiting list. But there was no waiting list to be arrested on charges of child abuse and endangerment. In 112 cases in our study, we learned that the way a pregnant woman's drug use came to the attention of state authorities was through the helping professions. Doctors or nurses, people in healthcare turned their patients over to state authorities with the power to punish, surveil, and control. So we tend to talk about criminalization. The cases we work on are quite dramatic, and locking people up in relationship to health problems is shocking. But what gets far less attention is the role of the child welfare system. As a result of the kind of media reporting, Mary Faith Marshall and others said one of the major responses was to start treating drug use by women who are pregnant women, pregnancy and drug use, as evidence of child abuse. And so this map needs some work, but you have more than 20 states where the law was modified to make evidence of drug use and pregnancy either the same as child abuse, an actual basis for concluding that a child has been abused. And that's like you give birth, and by giving birth, it is child abuse. Or you have mandatory reporting to child welfare authorities. And the map doesn't really show, for example, New York is not one of the states that has such a law, but the practice nevertheless is in certain hospitals in certain parts of the state, if you give birth to a baby who tests positive for anything, including marijuana, you will be reported for suspected child abuse and neglect. These are some of the families that we've worked with who've experienced that. The one on the upper right faced removal, finding of child abuse and neglect because she had been in methadone treatment while she was pregnant. And the state of New Jersey took the position that because her baby had the transitory and treatable signs of prenatal exposure to methadone and treatment, which is called NAS, that she harmed her baby, and therefore she could be subjected to the civil child welfare system. We did get the court to say that evidence of being in methadone treatment while pregnant, something that the state health department urges women to do, isn't necessarily child abuse, but they could still look at when she got into treatment, whether she followed it, leaving all things back to discretion and targeting of particular women. There is virtually no evidence-based peer-reviewed research that examines the question of whether there is a causal relationship between prenatal or parental drug use and child neglect or abuse. There was a report, a white paper by the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse in 1999 called No Safe Haven, Children of Substance Abusing Parents, that made the claim, and they had a great press department, got in all the papers, 3 to 5% more, you have a 3 to 5% greater chance of being abused and neglected if your mother used drugs while pregnant. What they never told you is that this isn't a peer-reviewed paper. This thing that launched all these states treating drug use during pregnancy as a form of civil child abuse was an opinion survey of people working in the child welfare system. And the report noted that those people had no training in evaluating drug use or addiction or anything else. And if you look at any of the claims and an entire federal website about the relationship between drug use and child abuse and neglect, it very often goes back to this non-peer-reviewed opinion paper. To the extent anybody's actually tried to study whether evidence of drug use by parents predicts harm, predicts actual maltreatment, the answer is yes, it does predict future maltreatment, as long as you define maltreatment as drug use. And so I like to bring this with me. It's still warm. This is what in many parts of the country, everywhere, including California, a drug test which can only tell you if somebody has used a drug within a certain period of time. It can't tell you whether they're drug dependent, whether they're addicted. It certainly cannot tell you, even if it's positive for opioids or heroin or fentanyl, whether somebody is a good parent, whether they're able to take care of the children, whether they love their children. And yet drug tests are the primary mechanisms by which people are put into this child welfare system and judged. I'd be happy to pass it around if anybody wants over here, want to test it. SAMHSA, Department of Health and Human Services, that has a wonderful brochure encouraging women to use methadone, even though in places like Massachusetts, as I said earlier, getting into methadone and buprenorphine treatment, which is the recommendation for women who are pregnant with opioid problems, in Massachusetts and elsewhere, it must be reported to child welfare authorities once the child is born. And the hope is they'll say, oh, you were good, you were getting treatment, but there's no guarantee because the report to child welfare is a report of suspected abuse and neglect. And the brochure includes this paragraph encouraging people to go to their child protective services for help. These are places that do not have the capacity to offer housing, to offer care, to be compassionate. They have the authority to take children away from people and subject them to surveillance and threats of removal. One of the things that we can do is do a better job of finding out when we believe we're mandated reporters, where it is that we're reporting people. So to wrap up, let me just say, what do we do? What are some of the things to think about? And of course, if we want to have so-called healthy pregnancies, we can recommend, as we often do, a bunch of things. Don't smoke if you do stop, don't drink, don't use illegal drugs, manage your stress, maintain social ties. That's the typical approach. Here's a different one. Don't be poor. If you can, stop. If you can't, try not to be poor for too long. Don't have poor parents. Don't live in a poor neighborhood. Practice not losing your job. Don't be illiterate. Avoid social isolation and try not to be part of a racially or socially marginalized group. We've been trying to figure out how to get people to think about these things. People often believe that women who don't get prenatal care should be punished. And if they don't go, it shows that they don't care about their existing unborn child or their future child. And we try to say, well, what happens if you pull the lens back and you find out that between her home and where the prenatal care center is, or between her home and where the drug treatment center is, the roads are impassable, that the structure makes it impossible for her to get there. And that works to some extent, but I have to say what I fear, and one of the things we have to figure out how to work on, is that just as often it seems to me the response is, well, she knew she lived there, she shouldn't have gotten pregnant in the first place. That our capacity for mother blame seems limitless, and finding the way to expand the picture beyond the destroyed road, beyond the individual women is one of the big policy challenges. Most recently, a prosecutor in the county attorney's office in Montana issued a statement saying, due to the high rates of drug and alcohol use, and let me point out, he's saying use. He's not saying dependency. He's not saying addiction. Don't get in your head an image of a woman who is strung out and she's just using, that he believes that he has the power to ask people to turn the pregnant women in. He urges women to turn themselves in for daily monitoring for the purpose of incapacitating their drug use. He does use the word addicted every now and then, but if carefully reading it is any drug use must be stopped, and the way to do that is to use the legal system to civilly restrain women, to monitor them on a daily basis, and to arrest them if they are not obedient. Right now, we are in the middle of the panic about opioid use and its impact. And one of the other things that the county attorney in Montana and others like to suggest is, well, women are using opioids. We just don't know what harm it's going to do. But we do know what harm it's going to do. Pretty much none. Women and people have been using opioids for hundreds of years. It used to be prescribed to pretty white women because it was one of the few things that could be used for treating pain. And if we were going to see a generation of damaged children, we would have already had that information. But the Montana and other people keep going back to, well, there must be some harm that's being done that we should stop. What can we do? We can remove barriers to treatment for everyone. I don't believe in prioritizing pregnant women, and the reason is twofold. One is, if you are a pregnant woman, it's likely you have somebody you love who might also need methadone or buprenorphine, and if only you can get it, what does that do to your relationship, and what incentive does that create for you to share the medication you're receiving? It also means that if you suffer a miscarriage or pregnancy loss while you're getting that treatment, you could be kicked out because you're no longer pregnant. So it has to be that we're looking at human beings, some of whom have the capacity for pregnancy, some of whom get pregnant, and our policies have to include everyone. We should ensure that prenatal care providers are all authorized to prescribe buprenorphine. There should be mandatory notice in prenatal care settings if you're opioid dependent. It will be confidential, non-judgmental care. We should insist that our child welfare systems be changed so that drug use, that this is not a substitute for an evaluation of parenting ability, that it is only when you actually neglect, actually abuse your child, and neglect, by neglect I don't mean being, having low income and insufficient ability to care for your kids. That should be addressed through our economic justice system, not through our child welfare system. We should make every person in a NICU observe parent defense advocates in child welfare court systems so they see what happens to people, and they are not under the illusion that if you call child welfare, you're arranging for a helping agency for the people who you turn in. Require that healthcare researchers investigate how their findings and statements are likely to be interpreted. If you really are a mandated reporter, and often people think they are when they're not, how you report can make a huge difference. Tell the whole story. Tell whether the parent is loving and caring and should be with her child. Your opinion will really matter. And provide interventions and care that keep parents and children, pregnant women and their fetuses as a unit. And most importantly, be kind, be compassionate. You may not be able to fix the problem you're seeing, but if you are dealing with somebody who actually has a dependency problem, who's struggled with drugs, if you are respectful, compassionate, non-judgmental, you may be the first healthcare person that person has ever experienced that kind of care from. I share this image from the group Young Women United in Albuquerque. They ran these ads on the sides of buses, and I thank you very much. And if you ask, I'll tell you about the time I got on the plane and forgetting to empty this before.
Sarah, come on up. My phone is blowing up with questions from friends, colleagues, collaborators, and people from Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital who are listening in. Just by show of hands, are there people who have immediate questions in the room? I'm just curious. There's a couple. Okay, we prepared a few questions. We could actually talk all day, and I could talk to these folks all day, but I'm going to limit some questions that I have for Lynn and Sarah that we've prepared. And then I think we should take the questions in the room and the questions that are being sent in, because I think many of them are very interesting and fascinating. So first of all, thank you both for the overview. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, both from a data and a science policy perspective. I know deep down that there are pieces of this conversation where you are both very aligned and where both of you are not. And I think that you have very interesting perspectives on a couple of different things, but in a quick, probably 2 to 3 minute overview, can you walk us through what you think the current trends and policy approaches to alcohol and drug use in pregnancy are, and which do you see as promising, which do you have any concerns about, and walk us through sort of how you've given us a background around the racial inequities that are embedded in your assessment, but can you also talk a little bit about autonomy and individual autonomy within decision-making during pregnancy? Take a piece. You gotta press the one on the left.
No, it doesn't.
Why don't I give you this one?
Is that working now? Oh. Okay, that was a lot to cover. So to sort of take it a little bit more slowly and walk you through a little bit in terms of the trends. I mean, I think that what we're continuing to see are more policies that are punishing pregnant women for their drug use and their alcohol use. And when I come at the question of looking at these policies, and also questions related to thinking about how we should be addressing questions of substance use and pregnancy, I think there's two really important perspectives to be using for myself. One of them is a question of women's autonomy and women's reproductive autonomy. That's one really important lens. And then I would also say the other really important lens is thinking about what the evidence says and whether or not these policies and these approaches are actually effective at achieving any of the public health outcomes that people are trying to achieve. And I will say, having just completed analyses that we presented here about the effectiveness of these policies, I think this is one of those cases where the reproductive autonomy and evidence perspectives are actually quite in alignment. So the policies that I have concerns about, especially those that are more punitive from a women's autonomy, a women's reproductive autonomy perspective, they also don't seem to have any public health benefits whatsoever, and in fact, seem to have some public health harm. And I would also say that even on those that we label as supportive, actually like Lynn, I also think that I have concerns about giving pregnant women priority in terms of entering substance abuse treatment as sort of one of the core supportive policies that's promoted around substance use and pregnancy. For my concern, it's also a question of what if there's somebody else who wants treatment and they can't get in? You know, what if somebody's partner wants treatment and they can't get treatment? Might that also be just as important? Or somebody who has a more severe problem, problem throughout their life, and now they're ready to do something about it and they can't get treatment. So I think that we need to balance the way that we think about that. And then sort of bringing in questions of racial disparities, I think that one of the really important things to be paying attention to is that in terms of some of the more punitive policies, especially related to reporting to Child Protective Services, that Black women have bore the disproportionate burden of that punitive policy. And we really see no evidence from a public health perspective that it's making a difference.
Can you just specify what your question was about autonomy? What do you mean when you ask us to address that?
It was really more under the auspices of which policies do we have concerns about and impinging upon women's decision-making and autonomy. But you can answer it from a different perspective, which I know you might.
Well, the trends, I think I touched on some of them. Especially, I recently had the opportunity, thanks to Monica and others, to be part of an American Public Health Association town hall sponsored by the Maternal Child Health Division about pregnant women and opioid use. And the other speakers, one was from the CDC and one was from the Tennessee Health Department, presented the issues as a problem of an increase in neonatal abstinence syndrome. And the way that we should address that, there are two primary methods of preventing NAS, the transitory and treatable condition that some newborns experience if they were exposed prenatally to opioids, or the medical treatments for opioids. And that is prevent the use of opioids by pregnant women, raising lots of concerns about access to pain relief for pregnant women, and prevent pregnancy. Because if they just stopped getting pregnant, we wouldn't have this problem. So the trends seem to be not about enhancing overall access for everyone to care, to asking more questions about why are pregnant women using drugs. There's one narrative only The pharmaceutical companies pushed opioids, and that's why so many pregnant women are dependent on them. That is part of the narrative, but if it's the only thing that we talk about, then we are not listening to the women themselves, saying, well, what's going on for you? Why are you still using them? What are the problems that you're seeing? So that, and we see an increase, and this is particularly frightening, much more and more surveillance and control. Reuters did a piece that was as alarming. Reuters did a piece about pregnant women and opioid use and treatment for opioid use that was as alarmist as any of the false media from the 80s around pregnant women and cocaine use. And they purported to have data showing that evidence of opioid use or treatment for opioid use was likely to lead to child death, and therefore the way we prevent that is making everybody reported, get everybody reported to child welfare authorities. What they didn't acknowledge was that, in fact, there was an extremely low rate of death, as tragic as any individual is, for families in which there was opioid use. They didn't acknowledge that many of the children had been reported to child welfare and died while they were under the supervision or within the knowledge of child welfare. And we have, as a result of that article, a push to get more and more women subjected to the control of those agencies. So that's a very important thing to look at. The reason I reacted about autonomy is I do think that growing out of the abortion debate and sort of the typical way, particularly second wave white feminists talk about abortion rights. We talk about women's rights and their autonomy. But what the responses and trends are about isn't simply their right to decide. It's about loss of physical liberty. It's about being forced to undergo treatment they don't consent to, that isn't appropriate for them. The lack of access to health care, making it simply about individual autonomy, misses the responsibility of government and our society to provide the health care and the economic well-being that people need to lead healthy lives before they're pregnant, while they're pregnant, after they're pregnant, if they never get pregnant.
Thank you both for sharing that. I'm just sort of, my mind's racing, but I do have to add in a question, a follow-up, Lynn, to what you just said. One of the text messages that I've gotten has really said about your slide where there was what people read as reproductive coercion, i.e. if they would take sterilization or birth control and cash payments. They said, could you please elaborate on how common is that and where are we seeing that occur?
So Project Prevention started in California. It was started by a woman named Barbara Harris, who had adopted several children who had been prenatally exposed to drugs. It is not thus far a government-funded program. It is only a private program. But as I've pointed out in articles, the U.S. Eugenics laws started out as private proposals. Barbara Harris offers $300 for women who use drugs to get sterilized or use long-acting birth control. I've actually looked very seriously at what she does, and over the course of now more than 20 years, she's actually reached relatively few women. And some of them call National Advocates for Pregnant Women, mistaking us for them, saying, can I get $300? And what I've learned from that is these are people who want contraception, but who are also impoverished, and they'll do whatever they can do to get money that they need. And I'm like, more power to you. I hope you get contraception that you want, and go ahead and get that $300. What she's been effective at, and which is why some right-wing folks have funded her over the years, is not that she's reaching that many women, or that many women are necessarily getting contraception or sterilized that wouldn't want to otherwise. It is that she is a voice for all of the misinformation, that these children are damaged, that these women all have 20 babies. She is, her power is in promoting a narrative that leads to various kinds of controls and punishments.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. A question for both of you. Should we be paying attention to alcohol use during pregnancy, drug use during pregnancy, or both? And why?
So I would say from a public health perspective, from an evidence-based perspective, we do have evidence that alcohol use during pregnancy does have adverse effects. The evidence around drug use during pregnancy is not clear, especially in relation to marijuana use. And so I would say, I think there is solid public health justification for paying attention to alcohol use during pregnancy. I'm not talking about paying attention to somebody who had a drink before they discovered they were pregnant or has one drink every once in a while they're pregnant. I'm talking about women who are drinking a lot or women who have symptoms of an alcohol use disorder. Should really be focusing some attention there from a public health perspective. And I also say this when they were discussing this a little bit on our way over here, that some of it is that with alcohol use during pregnancy, I'm not a clinician, but my understanding is that the harms due to alcohol use during pregnancy are not reversible. And so it's really important to be paying attention to figure out how to reduce the harms. I would say from drug use during pregnancy, there is some evidence that some drugs do have some adverse effects. I really think that we have an opportunity here in relation to marijuana during pregnancy and how to have an appropriate set of policies and responses that do not assume that that marijuana use during pregnancy is harmful, given that we don't have data on that, and that we should be really making sure that our policy responses and our do not overblow or overstate or over punish or punish at all pregnant women for using marijuana. So I would say I think the public health task in relation to marijuana right now is really about making sure that all of the anxiety and concern about it doesn't get written into policy. And I would also say that thinking about this from a public health perspective in relation to other drug use, I also think that something similar should be done, that we should make sure that the anxiety around the harms from drug use during pregnancy is not written into our policy responses.
So I'm going to go a little broader. Clearly, there is evidence of that fetal alcohol syndrome is a real thing, and that can happen. And typically, as I understand it, also not being a medical person, it usually seems to involve huge amounts of alcohol use, potentially with prenatal, certain genetic predispositions and issues around nutrition. What I'm concerned about is any message that says abstinence is the only safe thing to do, and otherwise you are risking harm. Our whole approach to pregnancy right now, I think, is part of the distraction from all of the I guess my students teach me that this is sort of the neoliberal. It's all about individuals. We have this idea that if you can get pregnant women to behave a certain way, we can guarantee healthy birth outcomes. And in fact, the state of Wisconsin is arguing that's why they have to have their Unborn Child Protection Act upheld by the federal courts, because if they can control pregnant women, we can have healthy birth outcomes. But pregnancy is this biological process. By becoming pregnant, a woman puts her embryos, fetuses at risk. 15 to 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage and stillbirth. And as human beings, we want to believe that we can minimize risk, that we can have control, that we can make sure that things go well and smoothly. And a lot of this conversation, it reinforces this idea that we have a level of control and guarantee that simply does not exist. And all it does is increases the notion that the burden is properly placed singly on pregnant women, that they can be blamed when something goes wrong, and that they are in a constant state of fear and shame in relationship to their pregnancies and the outcome of those pregnancies.
Sarah, you actually kind of answered my question already, but I work at the Department of Public Health here in San Francisco, and already since the recreational marijuana laws have come into effect, we've been seeing from the state information sheets and fact sheets about, marijuana use and breastfeeding and marijuana use and pregnancy and how dangerous it is, even though there's not a whole lot of evidence about it. And I'm just wondering, in both of y'all's fantasies, here we have PTBI, this major research institution that's promoting healthy births and reducing racial health disparities. What could an institution like this do to try and support particularly women of color in the face of already these kind of preemptive onslaughts of, state health departments criminalizing and being punitive around things that are not data-based?
That's a huge question and a great question. I would say I think there's sort of two pieces of it. I mean, one of them is a question of thinking about what information we provide to women, especially what our health departments provide to women about the effects of different substance use during pregnancy and what the goal of providing that information is. I mean, it's almost as if, you know, from my perspective, it's like we have to have something up there that warns about the harms, as opposed to sort of taking a step back and thinking about it from a public health education perspective of what are we trying to achieve by providing information on this topic, and what is the actual goal of doing that? And are we achieving that goal by the information that we're providing, while also making sure that it's based in the best available evidence and communicating risk appropriately? So I think what I would say is that I think there's an opportunity to have that conversation about what is the goal of providing women with information about the effects of different substances during pregnancy. And if I recall from the PPBI symposium that I went to earlier, that is a larger conversation at PPBI about how to communicate about risk. And so I think that that could be sort of a component of that. In terms of thinking about how to protect women of color from punitive policies, especially anything new that's coming out as marijuana is being legalized, I think some of it is standing up and saying screening, like policies targeting screening policies are actually the way that these punitive approaches tend to start. So I think that it's really stepping back and evaluating what's going on in different healthcare institutions, what can local health departments do, what can PPBI do in terms of bringing people together to try and stop some of the punitive policies, especially the punitive policies that disproportionately target women of color. So,
can I just
I would add, and it sounds like you have a
just a follow-up question.
hot pursuit there. Warnings that are target women and pregnant women or pregnant people do that thing of reinforcing that the only people responsible for pregnancy outcome are the women or the people who get pregnant. I also think that one thing would be very interesting, or that should be included in any kind of work around this area, is who profits from policies that require surveillance? Who's profiting, as my mentor and friend Deborah Small would ask, from all the drug testing that is done and imposed on pregnant women, and where could that money be better spent? I do know that there are researchers who have very, very carefully looked at the published peer-reviewed research on marijuana and find it incredibly unpersuasive that most of the studies, and even when they find some significant difference between children who are prenatally exposed and not, they don't tell you that those children are still within the range of normal. All of Peter Fried's work in Canada, where he's just made his career saying that marijuana does have some impact on executive functioning, when you actually press him, and he's been very helpful in challenging punitive approaches, he says, oh, well, none of the kids I worked with were reported to child welfare, none of them were taken away from their mothers, and they all went to college. So that you can find an impact doesn't necessarily mean that it has meaning in terms of actual lives of people, except to create vulnerability for more punishment and surveillance.
Just to follow up, I really appreciate this discussion and question about, given that there's a lot of discussion about the additional tax revenue that's going to be generated from cannabis, and that there is a discussion about trying to increase surveillance, or not surveillance for surveillance sake, but surveillance to understand patterns of use and how that may have an impact on health outcomes. What would the recommendations be to thoughtfully think about how we probe the question about health effects of cannabis?
Also, one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to that, and this is something that is likely to make me very unpopular with some people, is that I do think that there is a possibility when you that people might start substituting marijuana, now that it is legal, for other substances. And I think people have been studying that in general in relation to marijuana legalization and the impacts on alcohol use, and whether people are substituting one for the other or combining use, right? So if you're using both at the same time or just adding more marijuana onto alcohol, that would have a very different public health effect than if people who were drinking reduced their drinking and started using marijuana instead. And so I think that in relation to pregnancy, there's a really intriguing thing to be studying from a data collection perspective of, are women changing their patterns of use, substance use during pregnancy now that marijuana is legal, away from substances that there is documented harm towards marijuana. So I would say paying attention to the substitution patterns is a component of the surveillance trends that would be worth paying attention to.
And I would say for any of you who are likely to be writing articles and getting published, that please think about the fact that the people reading that include policymakers intent on finding reasons to punish. And so how you frame what you say in your introduction and your conclusion, anticipating that misuse or misinterpretation of your data. I will tell you, in Tennessee, there are health people who are very proud of the fact that they started doing surveillance so that they could document the increase in use of opioids by pregnant women. And the primary way, what they don't tell you after they tell you how great their surveillance is that that data was what was used to justify the legislature passing a law, a fetal assault law, that specifically authorized the arrest of pregnant women. It was framed as if it was a law that would only address opioid use, but in fact, it was a law that allowed surveillance and arrest of all pregnant women. So that is how surveillance data often gets used, even though I believe in evidence-based research. I believe in information. And the other thing in general, what we saw in Colorado is when marijuana became legalized, the first response was to try to find ways through the child welfare system to punish and control. So legislation to make having marijuana in your house child abuse. Legislation proposed to make pregnant women who used marijuana automatically determined to be abusers. So it is a way of doing backlash, and anticipating that and fighting it from the beginning would be very valuable.
I know we're ending short on time, and I know there's one more question, so I'm going to ask for you just to give a quick snippet to my question, which is, well, first of all, I want to say I'm completely blown away by all that you two have contributed to the world. Like, I'm jaw-dropped and amazed by how awesome you are. So my mind has expanded so many times. So I want to ask you this question. For so many women who are pregnant and substance involved, they're juggling competing priorities and navigating to the best of their ability these various priorities. One of those priorities may be their partner or partners. And you mentioned that a couple of times with regard to access to treatment. But can you share with people who care for women who are substance involved, what are some promising ways of engaging with male partners?
Well, Sarah actually has to do research before she speaks, so that's where we come back next year. We'll come back. But well, this is not exactly an answer, but something I just want to say is that so much of the research takes place without ever doing the first part of the question, which is asking the women, why are you using the substance? How does it help you? Is it still helping you in the ways you thought it would? What's been your experience with it? What does your partner do? How do you feel about it? That we forget to talk to people and see them as experts who can give us valuable information. So, I worry too that one of the quotes you put up is women saying in your study, you don't want them to know you're using, so you're going to wait to stop using. To really think about what we mean, that use is not the same thing as a physiological dependence, is not the same thing as having drug use that has become for the person defined by them as a problem. And those distinctions don't get made, and we automatically put a particular image of a certain kind of person in there, which makes it even more important that any instrument you do develop to figure out what might work includes lots of listening, respectful listening to the people you're trying to help.
So I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I do think that it does raise something that's worth thinking about, which is that women are not necessarily completely isolated. They often have other people in their lives. And when we're thinking about substance use in pregnancy, from talking with clinicians who care for women when they deliver, one of the big questions is what's going to happen to the baby. And if they have an active substance use disorder, are they going to be able to adequately care for the baby once they go home? And I think one of the things that gets ignored in that conversation is that sometimes and often women have other supports in their lives, whether it's a mother, a sister, a partner who isn't using, who are there and available and ready to support and care for the baby. And I think that as we start paying attention to that, rather than relying solely on the idea of reporting to Child Protective Services, that's also another way to be providing support.
Last question.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to hear this presentation. It was well done, and especially around just even showing the clip, an example of how women are punitive when they don't are racially profiled in the court setting. But my question in terms of when with marijuana is that we have a local program called the Black Infant Health Program. And one of the things that came out of the support group is that the women were encouraged to use marijuana by their providers because it would counteract the nausea. And so being that they're, and they have a trusting relationship with their providers, not knowing that this could be later as a, at risk of them possibly when they get ready to deliver any, findings in their, for drug testing. And so how do we deal with what recommendation would you provide for that kind of, how do we educate in those type of support group setting? And then another question too is how can we ensure locally with our hospitals that we're not doing with some of the other counties and other places where we still punitize, making sure that women who deliver that they have had substance in their system, that their baby is getting taken away without, having some policies in place that's going to help them to get better.
So I will give you my very sort of short answer to your second question first. It's a very short answer and really hard to make happen. But I would say that as you're thinking about designing, right, as you're thinking about any system that identifies and or responds to drug or alcohol use during pregnancy, it's really important to think about what is the purpose for what you're doing. What's the outcome that you're trying to achieve? And from my perspective, I would say that any set of interventions that are developed should be designed to support the woman to have a healthy baby, if she wants to parent the baby, to help support her to make that happen. And I would say, as in terms of really thinking about that, I think it's really important to bring people together and to be really intentional about the set of policies that are being developed and implemented, and be really clear on what the goal is. And from conversations with a lot of providers, everyone has a different reason about why they're drug testing or what they think will be accomplished by doing a drug test at the time of delivery, or what's going to be accomplished in terms of Child Protective Services reporting. In response to your first question on a very concrete level, I think that it is on the provider to document in a woman's chart that the provider is the one who made that recommendation, and make sure that that information is then conveyed to the hospital where she is delivering. I think that is an incredibly important thing to do in terms of making that recommendation. And on top of that, I think another important thing to do is that if providers are identifying drug use or alcohol use through screening purposes during prenatal care, it is of utmost importance that they also document any changes that women are making or the other types of support that they're getting, and making sure that that is communicated and not just the positive screen. So make sure that they are communicating all of that at delivery as opposed to just a positive screen.
Those are great suggestions. There's a study of moms in Jamaica where they use a lot of marijuana and their kids are really healthy and beautiful. And we act like this is some, terrible thing that is happening in the United States. People have used drugs forever. People don't like to be in pain. People don't like to feel sick. So the recommendation that women use marijuana because it's effective in dealing with nausea is something that should be talked about more. And one of the things that I don't know what to do about child welfare systems. They're so punitive. They're so out of control. They're so part of a long history from removing children from Indian families and putting them in boarding schools and taking so-called orphan immigrant children who really had mothers and putting them in the Southwest to work on people's farms. This is a cycle over and over again of actual destruction of families. But certainly those of you working who are doctors and working and nurses in public health, insisting on talking to the people in the child welfare system and saying it is not acceptable to be misinformed, to be prejudiced, to be frightened by evidence of drug use and mistake that for having anything to do with good or bad parenting. Personally, I think maybe there should be a law, and they could be more sophisticated or subtle, but you won't be reimbursed for drug testing for anything that doesn't lead to an actual treatment. That would be helpful, because the drug testing is often listed as a treatment when it is not. So how do we stop wasting the money on that?
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, we are over. And I thank you all for staying. Can we please give an applause to Lynn and Sarah? And there are people who, interestingly enough, had a couple of questions. I will email them to you who are participating by Zoom. I thank all of you for your questions, for your listening, for your insight. Sarah and Lynn are both also very generous with their time. And so if you do have a question that was not answered by them, I'm sure we can get it to them if you can email us and email the Preterm Birth Initiative. We'll get those questions to them. But thank you for coming. And I really appreciate both of you and the work that you've done in the world as well. Thank you.